Okay, welcome and good morning to this network webinar hosted by the Ontario Network of CAPC CPNP projects. My name is Sydney Bell and I'm the program lead for the network. And I'm very delighted to be here this morning hosting this webinar on the topic of FASD education. We have our presenter here with us on screen. His name is Allan Mountford, and I'll certainly give him a chance to introduce himself in a little more depth and say hello. But before we do that, I have just a couple of housekeeping things for us here who have all joined together to listen to Allan's presentation. First of all, just acknowledging that we are recording this webinar, and that'll be available on our archives for all of our members to access. So to do that, I'll be making sure that everybody is muted and your cameras are turned off. But hopefully you're able to see us and hear us. I would like to point out to all of the participants who are here that we do have a chat function. So hopefully you're able to see that. It's a great place to say hello and introduce yourself and ask any questions that you might have. As the morning goes on, I will certainly be paying attention to the chat window and gathering any questions for our presenter to ask. I think that's it for technical. Again, please feel free to post any questions. And we are going to go until about 12 noon today. And I think that's about it. So I would just like to take a moment to pause and offer a land acknowledgement, and then we will get started. So the Ontario Network of CAPC CPNP projects acknowledges and thanks the First Peoples of the territories where we work and serve, and other Indigenous peoples for sharing this land in order for us to come together today. So with that, I'm really delighted to again introduce our presenter today, Allan Mountford, and he's here to speak to us about FASD education. So Allan, passing it off to you is please introduce yourself and please let me know if there's anything that I can do to support you during this session. I will probably go off camera, but I will still be around. Just call if you need me.
Great, thank you, Sydney, very much.
Up to you, Allan.
All right, good morning. Anim, bonjour to all my treaty territory friends. I am speaking on behalf this morning, actually, of a group of very dedicated people. We are the FASD, the Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder Ontario Network of Expertise Education Action Group. And I represent some very hardworking folks on our committee, and I will introduce their names to you in a minute. So what we're about to experience over the next hour is actually it's a collaboration of all the minds in that group to bring you the message about education and children with FASD. There we go. Thank you. So I started this journey over 2 decades ago when I coincidentally saw some rather different behaviors in my classroom. I work with the Durham District School Board, and I work with challenged youth in what used to be the Section 23 programs. We now call them the care, treatment, custody, and corrections programs. And I saw these behaviors, and then I had a colleague of mine also come to me within the same week saying, "What do you know about FAS?" And at that point, I knew very little. So it began my journey. And along that journey, I have spent a lot of time with some very knowledgeable professionals. I've spent a lot of time with kids with FASD. I've spent a lot of time with families with FASD. And it's what I found is that although there are some characteristics that we see with children with FASD, some specific characteristics that tend to keep surfacing. We also know that every single child with FASD is totally different. And that has to do with the physiology of the fetus while it's developing and the amount of alcohol that's introduced at that time, et cetera, et cetera. So what we have found is that I've found over the years is that in terms of education, educators get very confused with what to do with kids with FASD because they don't often fit into a specific pigeonhole the children are supposed to fit into, and from which we then provide remedies for behavior and pedagogy and education. So it has led me down a path where I've spent a lot of time looking at the issues around this, and along with this group of folks, as I said, the Education Action Group, we now feel that we are able to provide some strategies, some direction to educators. Sorry, I'm having some technical, there we go. So here's our Education Action Group. Mary Cunningham, Jason Brown, Tracy Grant, Stephanie Jones, myself, Danielle Reynolds, and Laura Spiro. And where you can find us is on the FASD-1 Ontario Network of Expertise website. This talks about who we are, and in the education sector, you can get all sorts of information. As you see down here, we have behavioral characteristics of students with FASD, what to look for in the classroom, some screening and assessment suggestions, and we have some quick start supports we call our education essentials. Then we talk about the different types of exceptionalities that the ministry has designated. And so on this website, you can get all sorts of information put together by this group, and I suggest that you visit that site. Okay, so as educators and as professionals, one thing that I've noticed over the years is that we ask fish to climb trees. And Einstein said it very well: if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it's going to live its whole life believing that it is stupid. Well, the challenge is that we ask these fish to climb trees for all sorts of good reasons, and we don't do it maliciously. And as dedicated educators, we do this truly with the best interest of, quote, the fish in mind. But here's the challenge. The challenge is that no matter how often we ask the fish to climb trees, no matter how many studies we do about why fish cannot climb trees, no matter the fact that all the birds and the squirrels are having a field day out there climbing these trees, fish will never be able to climb trees. So when we look at, why would we even ask a fish to climb a tree? Well, we might do that because the rest of the animals are climbing trees. We might do that because there are curricular expectations that have to do with, physical fitness, maybe have to do with choosing routes to get away from predators. Maybe it's choosing routes as a predator. Maybe it's just, there are all sorts of curriculum reasons why we might do this. And as caring professionals, we find all sorts of ways to try to help the fish to climb the trees. Doesn't work, folks. So what we end up with is a really frustrated population of children out there because they're being asked every day to do something that they can't do. And in terms of incidence of FASD in Ontario, a current study that came out in April of, I'm going to sort of switch screens here, that came out in April of this year from Poplova, Svetlana Poplova, says to us here that between 2 and 3% of our elementary school kids have, in the GTA, have prenatal alcohol exposure. A study done by Philip May in the States a couple of years ago came out with statistics from 2.4 to 4.8%. And it's my belief in spending time out there in the real world with kids with FASD is that we're probably looking somewhere between 8 and 10%. And I think what we're going to find is that the incidence will increase, whether it's because of raw increase of kids with being prenatally exposed, and that's a very good possibility as we're watching the amount of alcohol use by women climb. But it also is going to be related to the fact that professionals are now becoming more aware of FASD, and I think we're going to have an increase in assessment and diagnosis based on that. With that in mind, I want to bring to your attention here, and wait till you see this. This came out last Friday. Up to 17% of children could have symptoms consistent with FASD. A study of 13,500 children in the UK, and now keep in mind this is not diagnosed, but this is being screened for prenatal alcohol exposure. They're saying up to 17% of the children could be exposed. So what we know is that FASD is out there, and we know that that it's larger than even what they're suggesting now. Popova said in her study that, or said after her study, that she feels that this 2 to 3% is pretty conservative. Keeping that in mind then, let's be conservative and say 2%. Then that says to us that 40,000 Ontario students are affected. So if we go 2 to 3%, somewhere between 750,000 and 1.2 million Ontarians are affected by prenatal alcohol exposure. And that's huge. And it's huge because it's not being addressed in our province. And so that means that the people who are living with FASD and suffering with FASD are suffering a whole lot because the professionals around them don't know how to respond to them, don't know how to deal with them. And when we look at the expenditures in our province toward autism, it's huge what the government has spent for the children with autism in the school system, whereas kids with FASD, there's been nothing officially spent. There's no memorandum of understanding from the Ministry of Education saying we recognize this as a priority. So what it means is we've got all sorts of youngsters entering the school system, entering our daycares and early childhood centers, and entering the school system who have an affliction that is not being addressed. And part of that challenge is that most of the kids with FASD look normal. Now, we know about the facial features, the medical triad, the eyes being further apart, the philtrum being flat or compromised, and then the thin upper lip, that medical triad. But that represents only 5% of the kids who are affected. So the corollary of that is that we have all these children undiagnosed, looking normal out in our school systems. And those facial features will only develop in the 3rd or 4th week of pregnancy. So mom can drink up at that time and drink after that time, and those facial features will not be there. So bottom line is a child will look normal, and therefore we will have normal expectations. The challenge behind that is that we know that if the children don't get the proper supports and accommodations and strategies directed towards FASD, then they end up leaving school early. Anne Stryskuth, the grandmother of all the research for FASD in North America from the University of Washington Alcohol and Drug Unit, stated in her original studies that what they found out was that early school dropout leads to, well, it's common sense, leads to a marginalized adult life. And that looks like being in trouble with the law. That looks like being in trouble in the community. That looks like not being able to live life. As a matter of fact, 80% of the people in her study could not get a job, could not live on their own. We also know that adverse outcomes from FASD are preventable, provided we have the proper approach to the people who are affected. And what we're going to find in this presentation today is that what we have found, best practice tells us that when we look at it from a brain-based approach, then that allows us, that opens up a whole set of accommodations that we might not think of if we looked at it from a behavioral point of view. So what this says to us is that it requires everybody in that child's life to question the approach and the attitudes. I'm going to refer to my daughter a couple of times in this presentation. She's 26 years old. She just graduated from Western Teachers College, and she's starting the occasional teacher, the supply teacher route, which is what you have to do in Ontario to become a teacher. So she has, she's got herself a job at a public school, actually the public school she grew up in, and she is a, quote, supply teacher. I want you to look at these pictures. These pictures represent the environment into which she walks every single day. And the corollary to that is not only she walks into that environment, but so do 22 other young children walk into this sensory overload environment. So I want to talk about behavior a bit. We know that kids with FASD have trouble articulating how they feel. They have trouble articulating that things are bothering them. If you take a look at this environment, I think it's pretty easy to say that most of us would say that that would be a huge challenge for kids with FASD or with sensory processing difficulties. So it's really no wonder that they respond with behaviors. So what it means for us is that we have to figure that one out, because the kids can't articulate it. They can't say that. So sensory processing has to do with the information that goes into a child's brain. It's what the child sees, what they hear, what they touch, what they smell, all of the senses going in. And the challenge with FASD is that many of the kids with FASD have sensory processing disorders, which means that the brain has trouble dealing with all of these pieces of information going in, all of these sensory things going into the brain. So kids with sensory difficulties will respond in one of two ways. Either you have the hypersensitive child or you'll have the hyposensitive child, and both are really problematic to us in the education setting. The hypersensitive child may overreact to any pain, slightest bit of pain, may be really sensitive to lights, and especially fluorescent lights. And if you understand the operation of fluorescent lights, they work on the premise of pulsating gases. Well, for us, without sensory integration challenges, that may not be an issue. But for a kid with sensory problems, that can be a constant hum or a constant sensory overload to them. And they may react to sounds, especially loud, sudden sounds. Or you may have the hyposensitive child, and this is often represented by the kids who will rock forward, back and forth. They're constantly looking for some sort of sensory stimulation. They may show little or no response to pain. They may have broken arms and not even know it, may not feel that pain, may not feel cold. Sometimes these are the kids, especially when they get into their teen years, so they'll walk down the road in the middle of February with a t-shirt on because they truly don't feel, their brain doesn't register that feeling of cold. And then they'll often not feel hungry. I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to meet Miles Himmelrich. He has FASD himself, does a lot of research in FASD, as a matter of fact, and a lot of presentations. He will tell you that he has to be reminded to eat. He has his friends tell him it's time to eat, because he will go literally days without eating if someone doesn't remind him to do that, because his body does not tell him that he's hungry. So we've got kids who react negatively to sensory input, yet on the other hand, there are kids who crave sensory stimulation. If you suspect that There's possible sensory processing disorder. You may see some of the following. They don't like being touched. They don't like things like brushes and combs touching them because it hurts them. Tags on their clothing. Again, if you ever get a chance to hear Duncan McKinley, who's now working in London. Duncan McKinley is a child psychologist, and he has Tourette syndrome and huge sensory issues. Will say that when he was a kid, his parents would put socks on him that just had regular like lines, just some sort of texture in the sock, and his behavior would be off the wall an entire day, and he wouldn't know that, of course, until he got older. So tags or different textures of clothing can bother kids, and again, as I said earlier, they don't know how to articulate that. So what you get is the behavior. May react to loud sounds or to bright lights, or as I say, the pulsing of fluorescent lights. Maybe picky eaters, may not like certain foods simply because of the textures. May not like being touched. And of course, in a school setting where you're constantly, you have kids, and especially with young kids, they're constantly touching and poking and probing as part of their exploration, that can be a real challenge. Or the opposite, some kids they crave that being squeezed. And that's where some of you will be familiar with weighted blankets. For some kids, a weighted blanket is a really good feeling for them. It makes them feel comfortable. May overreact to small injuries, or may have an incredibly high pain tolerance. So this is part of the dichotomy of kids with FASD. Depending on their brain and depending on how their brain is responding to the sensory stimuli, you could get one end of the spectrum or you can get the other. May want to vacate loud areas, gymnasium where there are a lot of kids running around, may be too much for a kid with sensory processing challenges. And they may be really fearful or anxious in public settings, in any setting where there's a group of people, because they don't know they don't know how to deal with the sensory input with that many people. So what they may do, you see, they don't have the capacity, especially the little ones, they don't have the capacity to articulate that to you. So what you end up with is a meltdown, and when they get overstimulated. And what that is saying, that's the child's way of saying to you, I can't take it anymore. My brain has taken all that I can take. So the challenge here, and here's where we start getting into the exploring our reaction to the behaviors, is we can see that as a tantrum, which in most cases is usually associated with some sort of intention and manipulation, or we can see this as the brain responding to sensory overload, and we can address that. And that's really important to distinguish, because if we are addressing intentional behavior, that's going to look a whole lot different than if we're addressing a sensory overload, a brain-based challenge. So if you suspect sensory processing disorder, for crying out loud, get the kid to a doctor. So let's talk a little bit about speech and language and its relationship to learning. Communication is involved in all parts of education, whether it be orally, whether it be symbolically on a page. Communication is what gets information transmitted from one person to another, whatever the media is or the medium is. Children need to have well-developed communication skills in order to learn new concepts, make friends, read and write. And one thing that I've really experienced in dealing with families with FASD is that there's a huge difference in the final outcome for kids whose parents become really actively involved in their speech and language development. Playing with them, talking to them, listening to the child, putting their language into context for them so that they can now take it to the next step or the next level. When we teach children, we teach a concept. We then review that concept and assess that concept, and then we add to that. All of that involves communication. We know that that process, and especially parental involvement, increases a child's overall IQ. So information comes to us in basically, there's three sort of parts, three steps to it. One is the information going in. The second is what we do with that information once it is in our heads. And then the third is how we respond. So our receptive language, in terms of the youngsters, these are words and sentences children understand, even if they're not able to use those words in communication. They are understanding more about their world and about what we say than quite often than we give them credit for. Then there's the expressive language, which is the words and sentences that the child can use. And then there's the pragmatic language, the way language is used by the child in order to function in society. Sorry, just taking a look at my notes here for a minute. Okay, so the speech or the articulation that children have, this is their ability to produce the sounds that form words. And of course, our communication, our language starts with a letter, and that letter is associated with a sound. Those sounds are those letters are now put together to form words. Those words are put together to form sentences. Those sentences are put together to form an idea. And in writing, we put those together to make paragraphs. Each step of that language means that the child is able to express themselves better, able to communicate with the world around them in a better way. By 4 years of age, it's given that children should be 80% understandable by a stranger. So the developmental milestones, and thanks to Danielle Reynolds for this, 6 months should be able to turn or acknowledge sounds, look at a face, responds to smiles and to gestures. At 9 months, be able to respond to a name and to understand the concept of no. At a year, we get simple directions, 3 or more words, having an interest in simple picture books. And here's again where the parental part of this is really important. Then at a year and a half, should be able to identify the body parts. They've got 20 words in their vocabulary that they can use, and they like being read to. They like looking at the pictures. They like associating the words with the pictures. And at 2 years, we're into multi-step directions here. They usually have over 100 words. They're able to now start, in terms of the symbolic, they're able to start using crayons to express themselves. And then at 2.5 years, then we get concepts of big and little, here and there, tall and short. They should have over 360 words and should be able to understand familiar stories. And once again, if you're not seeing these milestones, then contact your local preschool speech and language program for referral to a speech and language pathologist. And the research tells us that when we get early assessment and we get involvement of speech and language professionals, it makes a huge difference down the road in that learning process that we talked about a couple of minutes ago. So oral language provides really the foundation for literacy, and I want to distinguish between language and literacy. Language is understanding the mechanics of language, the conventions of language, how language works, whereas the literacy is the understanding of that, understanding of the written medium. If they don't understand what they're hearing, they will likely have trouble understanding what they are reading. So we have hearing now involved as well. So when a child can't convey what they're thinking or convey their thoughts, then they will have difficulty with the written expression as well. So here's a connection between the oral and the written. So what? So what is FASD? How does that affect speech and language? And then ultimately, how does that affect education? We know that that when alcohol enters the environment of the fetus, enters the womb, then that fetus will sit in that alcohol. And what happens is that the cells that are supposed to join to build whatever it is that is growing, those cells do not often join because that first cell will dehydrate. So the next cell that comes along to attach will not be able to attach. So, so whatever it is it's supposed to grow doesn't grow. Also, cells will migrate to the incorrect places. They'll migrate to the wrong places. And one of the big things that happens with prenatal alcohol exposure is that the myelin sheath around the neurons will be thinner. And when that myelin sheath is thinner, then that means that the child will have a slower processing speed. So quite often, these will be the kids who we have asked a question and we're looking at them and we see like the deer in the headlights look coming back at us, and we're thinking that they're processing the answer. Well, in many instances, they're still processing the question. How many of what? Who is it? Is it in the past tense? Is it in the future tense? Does it involve me having to do something? All of these things are going through the kid's head. So the slower processing speed makes a big difference in terms of being able to be able to respond appropriately to language. They also tend to have a weak working memory. Like that's in terms of computer, that's like the onboard RAM, the random access memory, the stuff that the computer uses instantly to make decisions, not the long-term stuff, but the short-term stuff. So they learn at a slower rate. Remember what I said a couple minutes ago, we teach something one day, we assess it and we review it, and then we assess it, and then we add to that, and we use language to do that. With kids with FASD, we have to repeat and repeat and reteach. And they have an inconsistent memory. So when down the road, a couple of days later, we ask them, do you remember what we learned a couple of days ago? They may say no, because they truly don't remember. And then all of a sudden the next day, they do remember. And where do we go as professionals? We go to a place of having been manipulated. How come you couldn't remember it yesterday, but all of a sudden you can remember it today? In terms of verbal expression, kids with FASD tend to appear to be better at language than they actually are. Especially when you talk to young adults. They will talk a blue streak and it sounds like they know what they're talking about, and then all of a sudden you hear a large word placed in the wrong place or not used correctly. That to me is a big clue. With young kids, it's a lot of echolalia, a lot of speaking back just what they hear, or they can talk, but when you ask them what they've said, they cannot say the same thing again the same way. So we can't assume that there's a strong language base based on the verbal their verbal responses. When I get a kid come into my classroom that I suspect may have prenatal alcohol exposure, I go back to the OSRs and I go back as far as I can into their educational history. And what I generally find, if they do have prenatal alcohol exposure, is a history of health problems starting at a very, very young age. And it's everything from heart problems to ear problems to and especially a lot of ear infections, hearing loss, a lot of days away because of generally poor health. And that follows them through. And I spoke about Miles Himmelrich. He and CJ Lutke from out in Washington State actually did a study of middle-aged people who were going through a lot of old age health issues. So what can we do? Well, talk and sing to the children right from birth. Talk to them about what's happening with them and about what's happening with the world around them. Add to what they say. Give credence. Give affirmation to their language. Obviously use a lot of routines because then it puts things into a specific place in the child's day. We label their actions. Direct instruction. Not, don't do that. Here's what you are to do. Kids nowadays, especially this generation, live with screens. So let's spend some time with the children on the screens. Talk to them about what they're watching. The characters, what are they feeling? What are they doing? If you got a child going through a meltdown, we talked about meltdowns earlier as being a way of communicating. If a child goes into a meltdown, then that's the wrong time to have the discussion with them. Repeating correct words. Whoops, sorry, didn't mean to do that. Yeah, we got it going crazy here, folks, sorry. Okay, repeating correct words, but have the understanding that they may not be able to institute the correction. They may not be able to take that correction and use it correctly. And that frustrates adults because we assume that when we make a correction that that's part of the learning process and that the child has learned. Well, not necessarily so. We have to repeat and we have to reteach. And we never assume that the child has the language skills that they need to be successful at school. Never make that assumption. And language issues may arise over a period of time. They may be okay at 2 years old or 3 years old, and then find that as they develop, as their social use of language continues to grow, their language may not keep up. So I want to talk about something called dysmaturity for a second here. And this is a huge take-home message for us dealing with kids with FASD. This is the difference between the chronological age and the developmental age in different domains, specifically life skills, adaptive living, the things that allow a child to be successful in their environment. Now, so as I said earlier, every child is different, and the behaviors will differ for various kids. But the principle here that we need to understand is that a child may be chronologically, they may be developmentally half of their chronological age. So you may have a 4-year-old who is actually a toddler or a baby in terms of ability. And that's huge. And that becomes also very big as kids get older. So you end up with let's say a 14-year-old, and you have expectations of that 14-year-old as a 14-year-old when they're really functioning at a 7-year-old level. So I guess the question that you need to ask yourself is this 4-year-old, would I treat the 2-year-old the way I'm treating the 4-year-old? It's our dysmaturity. So in terms of school readiness, kids with FASD will often have difficulty with independence. So let's teach interdependence. Let's teach them how to look at the world around them and the resources around them and get them working for them. They have challenges in understanding what to do from observation. So that's where we get routine. We get structure and routine. And change our paradigm. And here I'm going to start using this word, change our paradigm to one of constant reteaching. They may be more pronounced if a child has missed sleep or meals or disrupted routine. Well, I've said kids with FASD often don't know when to eat. Sleep problems are very much a part of FASD. So what we need to do is we need to remain calm. We can't teach a kid who's in a meltdown because they are not able to express themselves properly. In terms of empathy, this is a big one in the classrooms. Kids with FASD often do not have the capacity for global empathy, for understanding how their behavior affects those around them. So they can't put themselves in another person's shoes. They may not understand why someone may feel differently than they do in a particular situation, may not understand why a child's crying, or understand that what they do may hurt another child or what they may say. And they have difficulty predicting. They can't link the cause and effect of their behavior. So we must be able to state things in really simple terms. And avoid blaming. Kids with FASD know they're different. Even at a very young age, we can't be blaming. They have difficulty managing those big emotions. So once again, we make sure that we don't try to work out the situation while they're in the middle of a meltdown, because they don't understand those big emotions. Often have difficulty refocusing to that place of calm. And if you know the zones of regulation, which is now used in a lot of environments, we're trying to get that child back to green. Well, in a lot of cases, they have difficulty getting back to that green, getting back to that state of being okay. And they have trouble labeling their emotions independently. So when we get to talk out the situation with these youngsters, it's then that we label the emotions. And we can bring those emotions to a physical state, such as, well, your face got all red when you did that. They have difficulty with nonverbal communication. We talked about the communication of the stuff going in, and then they have to process that information, and they have to come with appropriate expressive language. Well, a lot of that is accompanied with nonverbal cues, and kids have a lot of difficulty with nonverbal. They don't understand the taking turns. They don't understand sitting when they're supposed to sit in quiet circle, not touching other people. So again, we repeat the routines. We make sure that the routines are similar in different situations. Maybe that the child is only capable of being of silent play. So you may have toddler behavior. Remember, we may have a 4-year-old that's actually acting like a 2-year-old, and you may have parallel play where there's no discussion whatsoever, but the child is pretty comfortable just playing side by side. Can't understand right from wrong. Focus on the rules. Repeat the rules. Repeat the routines. May seem uncaring or unsorry. So again, this is something that you're going to deal with during the quiet discussions. And again, can't link cause and effect of their behavior. So that's where this one-to-one discussion comes into play. My favorite comic strip, Rhymes with Orange, totally bizarre, on a different planet. I want you to look at this. Kids with FASD will do what they do, and so many times they're doing it to please us, but you know what? The outcome isn't what we expected at all, and they don't understand that. You're missing the point. I got the fly. We'll take a look at the rest of the room. Oh, wow, we got some noise here. So I guess the question becomes, why reinvent the wheel? We have a whole lot of skills at our disposal, but the challenge is this. Is that, well, let me ask you this for a second. A child, let's say, no, I'm gonna continue with this, and I'll bring this up in a few minutes. Brain is a physical organ. It kills the cells, alters the where cells are going, alters the destination of cells, and reduces the myelination. And the number of interconnections that cells have. This comes from Diane Malbin. Diane Malbin is sort of the guru of the brain-based approach. So what she's saying is that these are physical changes. These are physical changes to the wiring of the brain. So that means that FASD, by default, is an invisible physical disability. The challenge is it's got behavioral symptoms, and we as professionals always, in our defensiveness, respond to the behaviors. But what it is a physical disability, which therefore requires accommodations. Every child has a story to give you. we talk about children having bad experiences throughout their life. And trauma-based classrooms is something we're taking a look at as educators. Kids with FASD aren't traumatized from the day they're born. They are traumatized from the day they are conceived. So they bring into this world quite a story, and it behooves us to listen to that story. Kristen Sowers, in her book, tells us that adverse childhood experiences, if you have a child with 3+ of these adverse childhood experiences, will be 6 times more likely to have serious school and health issues. Those are the kids with FASD. So why reinvent the wheel? We don't have to. So let's take a look at a decision tree here. So we see the secondary behaviors. We see the behaviors as a result of being dysmature. We see the behaviors as a result of not being able to communicate well and not learning well. We see the behaviors as a result of stimulus overload. So let's ask ourselves the question, what if this is a neurobehavioral condition caused by prenatal alcohol exposure or by something else? But what if we have a neurobehavioral condition here? What it says is that we take a look at our environment, and if we've got a good fit, then we don't have behaviors. It means we've done our homework, we've listened to the story about this child, we've done the assessment, and we put the proper accommodations in place. However, if we're seeing behaviors, if we're seeing the meltdowns, if we're seeing the withdrawal, if we're seeing the aggression, it says to us that we have a poor fit. It says what we are doing is not right. Not what the kid is doing is not right, but what we are doing is not right. So when we've got a student who won't cooperate, who appears lazy, who lies or confabulates all the time, is rude, steals things, and is aggressive in the classroom, let's take a look at the fact that maybe the brain damage has said that this person doesn't know what to do next, can't sequence things, can't predict, can't see what their behavior is doing to other people. And is really giving you that behavior because they're defensive, they are hurt, they're frustrated, they're overwhelmed, and they don't know how to respond appropriately. This one's a little more subtle. So let me help those who are having a little difficulty with this. If you take a look at the pictures are uneven. If you take a look at his eyeballs are uneven. But you see, his wife is being really picky. To him, the pictures look even. We have to remember that we're dealing with physical disabilities here, and how kids see things and how kids react to situations may be totally different. So let's talk about this paradigm thing again. So let's say we invest in the idea of trying not to fix the child, but to renovate the environment. Okay, so let's go back to our fish again. So we're asking our fish to climb a tree. Fish can't do that. We've done all sorts of provincial studies. We put all sorts of things into place. Fish still can't climb trees. The fish are frustrated. The teachers are frustrated. What's our answer? Our answer is to take a look at the environment, and maybe we put the fish into water. Same idea. We have the physical fitness component. We have the, finding different routes up a river. We've got all sorts of these things about the predator and the prey, getting away from predators and getting our prey. The curriculum is all still there. The difference is that the fish is now able to do the curriculum that we're asking. And also, in terms of a paradigm shift, in terms of the environment, the physical environment, take a look at that classroom on the left and take a look at the classroom on the right. Classroom on the right is the classroom from the David Livingston School in Winnipeg, school for kids with FASD. It's quiet. Yes, the information is there. And behind this blanket, there's all sorts of stuff on a bulletin board, but it's covered until it's needed. There's duct tape on the floor to give a physical separation to the children, and there's a soft spot for them to sit. Here is chaos. And when you get chaos, these kids are seeing that, visually seeing that chaos, they're living it. and you're going to hear about it. When I had the classroom at University of Ontario Institute of Technology for FASD, some of the things that I used. Number one, schedules. For my kids, taped to their desk, taped to the top of their desk, taped to the front of their desk. So I could see the schedule, they could see their schedule. We used the clock because time is an abstract concept. Using this clock made time a concrete entity for them. And then, of course, we use the zones of regulation so that we can work on strategies to get them back to that green zone where they're happy and they're able to learn. So the paradigm shift is real simple, folks. This is crazy. You're going to say, we spent an hour for this? Here's how simple it is. 1, 2, 3. So Diane Malbin invites us to take a look at what we ask a child to do. What is it, what is it, whether it be a curricular task or whether it be a behavioral task or a something social that we're asking this child to learn? What is it that the brain needs to do in order for that to happen? And then based on our knowledge of this child, what is that child's brain able to do? So we sort of, Diane Malbin talks about that as sort of the task analysis that you do before you ask a child to do something. So let's look at it. Understand spoken instructions. Pretty basic one, right from early childhood on. So the brain tasks needed for that, one of them is a fast auditory pace. Well, we know that kids with FASD will often have a slow auditory pace. And if we persist in asking them to do what, well, ask the fish to climb a tree, we're going to get anxiety, we're going to get frustration, we're going to get meltdown, we're going to get aggression. But because we know the child, we know the strengths are that this kid is a visual learner. Okay, you ready for this? This is pretty simple, isn't it? So we give the kid visuals, pictures, we walk them through it. It's that easy. However, the problem is that teachers who have been doing things a certain way for a lot of time often have difficulty making a change. But when you do this on absolutely every level, when you're dealing with children, when you do that with every task, then it becomes a habit and it becomes good pedagogy. So if you've got a kid that needs to let's say that the solution is to take a screw and to put two things together, we can give the kid a hammer and they can use the hammer to get the screw in. And because we've been handing out hammers our entire professional career, that's what we do next, is we hand out a hammer. Well, the kid with the FASD is going to look at that, and the kid's going to have a meltdown because, well, although the rest of the class is going to hammer the heck out of the screw and get it in and get it done, the kid with the screw with FASD is not going to understand. So what we're going to do is we're going to hand them a screwdriver. Plain and simple, it's an easy accommodation. However, here's the challenge, is that you've now got Sarah using a screwdriver, but the kids in the class have never seen a screwdriver before. They all use hammers. So the question is going to be, how come Sarah gets to use the screwdriver? Lesson from my daughter in this one. She's heard me do these presentations for years. And she said to me, you know, often you talk about this and teachers think, well, okay, the kid with FASD needs something special. And my response to that is, well, you know what? No, the screwdriver for Sarah is what Sarah needs. I want you to look at this. You've all seen this picture before, but I want to draw your attention to the boxes. Okay? The idea is, we all get the idea that you've got to get the smaller kid up. My point here is that there are 3 boxes here, there are 3 boxes here. We've expended no more resources for this young man to get to be able to watch the ball game. And of course, what's going to happen if you don't do that? The kid's going to, well, he's going to do a couple of things. Number one, he's going to throw a fit because he can't see what the rest of the kids are seeing. Or in worst case scenario, he might break the fence. He might put a hole in the fence, or he might decide to tear that board off. And in tearing the board off, he's going to hit Tommy beside him. Well, oh my goodness. So now he's hurt Tommy. All of a sudden, this little guy is going to get sent home from school. Why? Because all he was trying to do was to get to see what the rest of the kids could do. But when they respond, when we don't do things correctly, we then send them home. We put them on alternate school days. Or we call mom at 10 o'clock in the morning. Yes, she has to come from work. No more resources, guys. 3 boxes here, 3 boxes here. Okay. So couple of takeaway messages here. Number 1, think dismaturity. Ask the question, what if? Because you may have a kid who's functionally half the age that you're expecting. Get to know the child where they are on the FASD spectrum, which means assessments. We'll talk about that in a couple of seconds. You need to assess them, talk to them, find out what their story is. Find their strengths, because it's from those strengths that we can give the accommodations. Don't attempt to fix or normalize the child. Celebrate the uniqueness and build that uniqueness into the environment. And I'll tell you, behavior management, talk therapy, behavior modification will not work with kids with FASD because they're not able to predict. Think FASD, ask, what if? What if that's the reason why I'm seeing the behaviors? Use a brain-based neurobehavioral approach. And FASD supports work for the rest of the class. Believe me, it's good pedagogy. So what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And you know what? The ducks in the class and the swans in the class are going to be going, oh my God, that's awesome that they're using these accommodations for that kid, because you know what? It works for me too. Assemble the team as soon as you find out there's an issue. As soon as possible, the earlier the better. And remember that it's not that they won't do what you're asking them to do, but maybe because they can't. Couple of resources here. Education Action Group has put together the starting points for educators. It's what we call the Education Essentials. You can find this on our website. Whole host of things that you can look at. Second is this, developed by Sheila Burns, something called A Guide to Understanding My Kind of Mind. And it's 13 questions in a booklet format that take a look at everything from academics to socialization, right down to strengths and what they like to be able to do. Then there's the All About Me. All About Me was designed by actually Mary Cunningham, who I believe is on with us today. Again, takes a look at aspects of the child that you can articulate, and that can then go to the educators. Facets Canada, Nancy Hall does the training that Diane Malbin has been doing in the States for years. They have a screening tool, the Facets Neurobehavioral Screening Tool. You need to have take their education to do that, but it's again another neurobehavioral screening tool. And also, and I don't have this on a slide, but we can send this to you, is the Increasing School Readiness Background Information from the Lanark Community Programs, and there's a website for that. And then the CAPC and CPNP information as well. Community Action Program for Children, background from the PHAC site. I can maybe after the fact, Sydney, you and I can put those up as well. So there's all sorts of resources for screening and for getting that story for kids. And what we need to remember here, folks, is that relationship is the key. Your relationship with that child, your relationship with the support network is critical. And change only moves at the speed of trust. However much trust you develop with that child, however much trust you develop with the caregivers is going to determine your success. Question, Sydney, you're going to shoot me for this one, but I haven't left a lot of time for questions. But before we get to whoever's going to hang around for questions, I want to say Chimo Youth to everybody. Thank you very, very much for listening to me talk fast, and hopefully that was worthwhile for you.
Oh, Allan, thank you so much. You gave us an amazing foundation for really having a deep understanding for the paradigm shift that's needed and how we could go about that. Is there anybody on the webinar now who does have a question? You could either unmute yourself and ask or type it in the chat box.
Hi, Allan. This is Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi. So I have several questions. I guess the two most important ones to me are, one, is this whole whole presentation available in French?
Oh, no.
No, that's okay. Non, ça ce n'est pas okay. So that was one. Two, this presentation, because it encompasses so many different things, would you be okay with any of the participants sharing this with schools or school boards? Would that be okay with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I've had that question before, Sarah, and when I do my full 3-hour or full day presentations, there's a lot of storytelling that goes with that, and I'm so much of the content is associated with the storytelling, so I'm not comfortable with those going out there. But this, yes, what's in this presentation, absolutely share.
Okay.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you so much.
Does anybody else have a question?
This is Jackie Hart from York Falls.
Hi, Jackie.
Hi. I was just, I found it interesting, and I mean, this is not the first FASD webinar that I've been participating in. There's another one coming up in the new year. All of them have always been enlightening and thought-provoking on my part, at least. I find it interesting because a lot of the description of behaviors and development and everything else seem to resemble autism so much. And that's why, like, I have, for example, right now, I have a young woman that I'm working with, and nobody seems to want to pronounce themselves on the FASD because she has other diagnoses, such as a chromosome abnormality. They say that chromosome abnormality can resemble autism. It can resemble some of the symptoms of FASD. It can resemble this and this and this. So nobody wants to help her have a clear diagnosis. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe she doesn't have FASD. I'm just wondering, like, how can we help these kids? Like, I mean, she's a young woman who's going to go into the adult sector of services, and there is little to nothing, you know, for a child like her.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And you have defined the conundrum for professionals with FASD since we first found out about this. It resembles so many other things in so many other ways. However, the remedy for kids with FASD often is different from kids with other neurological disorders. And we also know that Philip May did a study 2 years ago, I believe, and they found that the amount of misdiagnosis and the amount of missed diagnoses was huge. I think it was like 85% in the population that he studied. In the people that ended up having FASD, either they had been misdiagnosed with another condition along the spectrum, or the diagnosis had been missed entirely. There's also documentation of autism being misdiagnosed, or FASD being misdiagnosed as autism. And when you understand the stigma around alcohol, I get that. I can see that. It's a whole lot easier to say your child has autism than it is to say your child has FASD. But I think the answer to that one, to be honest with you, is so ask the question, what if? And suppose you revise that question of what if this is a brain-based neurological disorder. Let's not worry about how it comes about. Let's just look at it from a brain-based paradigm and then deal with it. Then what that does is that opens it up. It allows you then to use the accommodations that you feel are going to be appropriate. And for kids with FASD, what you use this hour may not work the next hour, or may not work with another child. So it's a matter of constantly doing things differently. And there's where the really good educators are successful in dealing with kids with FASD or ASD or whatever, because they're recognizing the story, they're recognizing the difference, and they're shutting their door and they're doing what needs to be done. I don't think you can get hung up on whether they've got the correct diagnosis or not. You see the secondary behaviors. As soon as you see those, it's up to you now to find out why those secondary behaviors, what are the strengths of that child, and how do we accommodate for that particular kid.
Okay.
Does that help? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I was surprised to hear that 85% are either misdiagnosed or their diagnosis is completely missed, period.
Right, now that's one particular study, but it still gives us the same message that there are a whole pile of kids out there who are walking around with inappropriate education happening.
Yeah, and like, I mean, I'm not in the educational field, I'm in the mental health support field. And so and I know that a lot of what you suggested or that was presented today can work in both the home environment as well as the school environment. It's more difficult, and it's true, like the environment has to be changed. That's a part of the problem sometimes. It's just, yes, you did help me. It's just, like it's just that there's not, like you said right at the very beginning of the presentation, there's little to no supports out there for kids with FASD. There's no funding pocket that I'm aware of. There's no, clear services that are specifically geared to children with FASD. So it's very hard to not only recognize that what they have, but to actually work with it from there.
And to compound that, you're in the mental health field. To compound that is that FASD is a physical disability. It's not a mental health issue. However, the other side of the coin is that research tells us 94% of the people with FASD will have mental health issues. So what that means is that the mental health professionals go to their standard while they open up the DSM and they don't find FASD. Well, it's sort of anecdotally talked about, but it's not there because it's not a mental health issue, so they don't know how to respond to it. So a lot of the remedies that they use, especially around ADHD, are totally inappropriate for kids with FASD. Mm-hmm. And what we know is that that makes things worse. It actually exacerbates the problem for children. So thank you for caring, and I'll tell you, it's what I say to teachers: shut your door and do what you feel is right for that particular kid.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jackie, and thank you, Sarah. And unfortunately, we've run out of time here, but I really want to express my gratitude to everybody who joined us today and spent time expanding their knowledge and understanding of FASD, and to really extend my heartfelt and deepest gratitude to you, Allan, for coming and sharing of your knowledge and wisdom. I know my learnings have increased immensely in our time together, so I'm really, really grateful.
Can I ask one last question from Allan before he
Sure. One quick question, but we do have to wrap up.
Yeah, is there any possibility we can have your contact information? Because I'm wondering if I can ask our agency to have your full presentation at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you want to do that, Sydney?
Yeah, Allan, you could share what you want to, and then I could email it out to everybody who registered. Okay. All right.
Okay, so after the fact then, two things are going to come to you, actually three things. One is the PowerPoint presentation. Second, my contact information. And third, the Lanark County and the CAPC CPNP information.
That'd be great.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for your questions, for sure. So just before we sign off, I just want to have everybody be on the alert for upcoming webinars. In January, we have the social determinants of health for Indigenous populations coming up on January 17th. So the registration information for that will be coming out in the newsletter. And on January 23rd, we have a presentation about oral health in the early years. So please look for information about those and more webinars coming up both on WebConnects and in the newsletters. And again, thanks so much for joining us today. We will have a copy of this a webinar available that will also be sent out to everyone in the network. So Allan, thanks again for joining us, and I hope you have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you, and to you as well. Right.
Take
Bye-bye.
care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.